Onnit podcast. Ryan Lowery, Shawn Wells,
Yes.
in the house, and this is our first. I'm very excited today because for many reasons. Some supplements that we can't mention that we'll be working on together moving forward. Keep those on the hush. Very excited for that meeting later today, but also for this podcast because you guys are the first keto experts that I've had on. And I've been a huge proponent, a keto evangelist, if you will. And when I went on Rogan's, it was like, I got more questions on that. And I was like, I just want to talk about psychedelics with Joe. But apparently a lot of people are getting into this shit, and something that completely changed my life from fighting, being hit in the head as often as I had. And obviously there's a lot of science supporting how it can help not only with systemic inflammation, but help with cognitive function, sleep. The list goes on and on. So I'm thrilled to have you guys here sitting in front of me right now because the world needs to know about this stuff, and our listeners in particular. I do the Facebook Lives once a week, and we get more questions on keto than anything else by far. So, and Ryan, you're the author of the Ketogenic Bible.
Yes, sir.
Is that the title?
Yeah.
There we go. So let's just jump right in. First, let's get a little origin story on you guys as individuals. What got you into this space, and then how you guys started working together.
Yeah, so I'll start first. I actually was going to school as a business student, getting my marketing degree at Babson, #1 business specialty school in the country, and I was set on going that path. But then I went to a doctor, and I was getting my physical, and he told me he drew out this lifeline for me because I kept talking about all the supplements, and I love supplements, and I was working out, and I started using creatine, and I read this book, Optimal Sports Nutrition, Dr. Michael Colgan, and I was just super excited, and he drew out this lifeline for me. Why not be happy? Between here and here, you could see that I was just going to go out into the business world. And it totally changed my life path, this one doctor I went to. And so I decided to go back and get all these 2 years worth of prereqs on all these sciences. And then I got into Chapel Hill and got my master's in nutritional biochemistry and got my RD, registered dietitian, practiced clinically for about 10 years. But during that period of time, I decided to work with supplement companies, doing marketing write-ups, being a rep, going to Arnold, Olympia, all that kind of stuff. And I just kind of kept building my reputation on bodybuilding.com and all these places. And then I got picked up at Dymatize to be the director of R&D and help them sell to Post, and did about 300 products. We did products for Smoothie King, Advocare, GNC, Vitamin Shop. I mean, we were doing all kinds of stuff besides just Dymatize directly.
I remember Brock Lesnar promoting Dymatize in the UFC.
Yeah, we saw his fight where he got smoked, unfortunately. He was a Dymatize athlete at that time, but great guy. And then, and I should say, so during that period of time, I was really good friends with Dr. Jacob Wilson. We were very close. He was popular on bodybuilding.com, and he had his own board called ABC Bodybuilding with his brother, Gabe Wilson, both well-known PhDs in the muscle protein synthesis space. Gabe is actually with MHP now as their, what is his position?
Chief Science Officer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I got picked up at BioTrust and really helped pole vault them forward with their formulations. And I'm Chief Science Officer there. I have my own company, Zone Halo Research, doing formulations and novel ingredients like T-Cream, Dynamine, some of these ones that are out there now, several patents. And Ryan was studying under Dr. Jacob Wilson, just crushing it for his lab, and he's since become the keto preeminent ambassador. But we had similar passions, just on keto, on supplements, And we actually speak at a lot of events together. We'll be at FitCon together. We'll be at Arnold Brazil together, KetoCon. So we run in similar circles, and I'm just a huge fan of Ryan. So it's all good.
Love it.
Hell yeah.
Well, similar story. Grew up, background in athletics, played sports my entire life, and really wanted to study it. And said, how can I take this and actually do this for the rest of my life? And played sports up until college, won a national championship at the University of Tampa, and very quickly realized there's only so far you could go that I could go in the sports arena. And so I said, how do I take this and combine the passions that I have of truly helping people, but studying the research and science and make this into a career? And I was very fortunate early on in my college career to meet Shawn and Dr. Wilson, and they kind of took me under their wing and said, hey, this is what research is like. And it kind of opened up this entire new realm of, whoa, like this is really cool. And you can study people on like a molecular and whole body level. And so since that time, it's just been constant studying, research, everything from exercise and training variables to nutrition and supplementation and everything in between. And we published over close to 200 papers, abstracts, and book chapters at this point. And it wasn't until 2012, Shawn had been talking about it for a long time, but in 2012, we met Dr. Volek. Dr. Volek and Dr. Dom D'Agostino, very good friends and colleagues of ours. And it was a presentation at the NSCA conference. And Dr. Volek was giving a presentation on ketogenic dieting and endurance athletes. And someone in the audience stood up at the end and said, but Dr. Volek, what research is there on resistance trained individuals? And at that time, he goes, quite honestly, we don't have any. And so Jacob and I looked at each other. We're like, we have a lot of work to do. Like, if we're going to go down this path, we're going to go down and we're going to go down it hard. And so since 2012, it's been a pure focus of ours of studying, can individuals resistance training gain muscle mass? Can they lose fat mass? And everything in between. We were the first lab to really ever do a study looking at a ketogenic diet and resistance trained individuals, and found that you were able to make some of these gains. And that led us into publishing the Ketogenic Bible, where we basically talk about everything from the history to what are the different applications. Sure, endurance athletes, sure, epilepsy, which is where it started, but what about traumatic brain injury? What about cancer? What about Alzheimer's? All these different areas, which more and more research is coming out on. How can we explore those? And so now we're actively, we just published that book. We're actively writing and putting out content on like ketogenic.com and authorities like that, of just saying, hey, there's so much information out there that more and more people need to get that awareness. And so it's an honor to be on the podcast with you guys, and honored to be here.
Hell yeah. I'm absolutely pumped. And I remember, I first got into it. I think I heard Dominic D'Agostino on Tim Ferriss's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And, with how the way he was wording it and what he was talking about and its applications for brain stuff, obviously working with the Navy SEALs and seeing the applicability and crossover, not just, obviously if it impacts children's neurochemistry in a way where it can affect drug-resistant epilepsy the way that it does, maybe there's some carryover into adults. And looking at, rebreather oxygen problems and issues with the Navy SEALs and taking it from there, and then looking at exogenous ketones and everything from that made me want to get into it. So I kind of backtracked all of his recommendations. I read The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I remember Volek, like even in those books, it was all on like the Western States 100 and shit like that. It's like, I don't want to fucking look like an ultramarathoner. I use ketosis to run an ultramarathon, which I'll probably never do again at 238 pounds. But,
wow.
Like in those things, and it works, there's no doubt. But it's hard to explain something like this, because first of all, everybody wants the magic bullet. And everybody talks about that. And ultimately people want shortcuts. That's why exogenous ketones have exploded, right? And I think they can be used in the right way at many different applications to help people. But ultimately, dropping the carbohydrates is where you see the most bang for your buck, not just from how you feel cognitively and all the systemic benefits, but also how the exogenous ketones work in your body. Like there's an affinity for them, then, you really can get more out of it. But I have such fucking gratitude for guys like you that are on the front lines looking at this stuff, because it's something where I get a lot of feedback from people on like, hey man, I want to gain muscle. I don't want to cut my protein to 80 or 100 grams a day. You know, there's still there's a lot of dogma around that, you know, from the bodybuilding community and from people that think you have to have, 2 grams per pound or whatever the case is. And that's just not how it works in the body. Can you guys talk a bit about the anti-catabolic chemistry behind ketones and how this can give us some of that wiggle room with less protein in the body?
Yeah. Do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, for sure. And that was one of the biggest questions, right? Going into this research is, how is it possible to gain muscle? People think you need all these carbohydrates to gain muscle. It's impossible to gain muscle without them. We actually did animal study first and then the human model. So we actually took ketones, exogenous ketones, and gave them to animals and showed that it initiated muscle protein synthesis. So ketones themselves are anabolic in nature. They're triggering muscle growth by themselves. At the same time, if you look at muscle protein breakdown, ketones spare the breakdown of important amino acids like leucine. I'm sure everyone here is listening knows what leucine is, a very important amino acid for triggering muscle growth. If you're preventing that from being broken down, potentially allowing for more muscle protein synthesis to occur and occur longer. And so under these conditions, when you're in a state of ketosis, you're seeing not only increases in muscle protein synthesis or muscle building, but potentially preventing muscle protein breakdown. And that's exactly what we saw in our study in these individuals who were able to gain just as much muscle as these high carb athletes while on a ketogenic diet.
I think that's actually like twofold, because there's the improved muscle protein synthesis, but you have this leucine sparing effect that he's talking about, that there's insulin sensitivity improvements on the ketogenic diet. And when you see, if you go in the hospital, for example, and you see people that are immunocompromised or people that are just older, they have something called sarcopenic obesity, where they're trading off tissues, right? They're trading off, muscle for fat as they get older, even if they're not getting heavier. And this is happening, I think, largely because they're becoming more and more insulin resistant. And so if you actually improve your insulin sensitivity, you lower your leucine plasma threshold needs. So let's say, you always hear like 2.5 to 3 grams or 3.5 grams to optimize muscle protein synthesis. That may be in a Western diet athlete. Maybe that's someone who's 30 years old eating high carbs. But someone who's on a low carb ketogenic diet, it may be 1.5. It may be a much lower amount of leucine to trigger muscle protein synthesis. And so you get this unique thing that's happening where you can actually get more muscle accretion, more lean body mass gained, but have lower needs for leucine. So people say, oh, you need 25 grams, which would equal about 2.5 grams of leucine, 25 grams a whey. But maybe it's only, when you're on a ketogenic diet, maybe it's only 10. Like that data needs to be done. But there's some interesting things happening there that, that could be the reason that we're seeing like this lower need for protein on the ketogenic diet, but guys still gaining mass. And everyone says, well, you need, X grams, like you're saying, of protein. You need all this protein. You need 40 grams of protein, bolus. You need 200, 300 grams a day. Maybe this is the reason why we're seeing guys gain mass, but you don't need that much.
Talk a little bit about this low end capacity. Everybody, it seems to come up time and again. And Rob Wolf has kind of gone back and forth on this. Ultimately, I think he's eating carbohydrates once per day and then going low carb and then doing a great deal of intermittent fasting. He's in an 8-hour window of eating or less, maybe even a 6-hour window, most 5 or 6 hour window. Mm-hmm. That's due to him wanting to do old man jiu-jitsu and really push his body glycolytically, right? I've found that as a black belt in jiu-jitsu, I simply don't have to work that hard unless I'm going against like a serious black belt who's my size. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel that need there. But when it came to powerlifting, I would notice that in that 4 to 6 rep range, no drop off at all. Maybe if I was trying to hit a max effort single or a double, then I would feel a little drop off. And there seems to be some new guys coming out, like this Keto Gains guy from down in Mexico City.
Luis.
Yeah, Luis, where you can cheat the system almost with a small amount of carbohydrate pre-workout. Doesn't kick you out of ketosis, but then you get that glycolytic blast that you need to go heavier in the workout. Is that something that you guys have been looking at, or I mean, can we dive in and break that down a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. People refer to that typically as like targeted ketogenic dieting, where they're targeting the carbohydrates around the workout. And I always look at it like this: for athletes and that are implementing a ketogenic diet, utilize carbohydrates as a tool. They're an ergogenic aid at that point. That's how they should be utilized. And when you're getting these, like Luis is implementing carbohydrates around his workout, the key is this: when you're doing high intensity interval training or you're doing a hard workout, the adrenaline response that you get typically blunts insulin, which is why after his workout, he's likely still in ketosis, even though he might have had 25 or 50 grams of carbohydrates, because he's blunting that response and burning through it so rapidly, only getting the ergogenic effect without necessarily getting the blunting of fat breakdown or the blunting of lipolysis in that regard. So I think for athletes, it can be a tremendous tool. A lot of athletes are utilizing like exogenous ketones to try and get something similar for the ergogenic aid. It's going to be interesting. We haven't compared them directly, but we know a lot of athletes that are incorporating that.
Yeah. I use it. Like I play competitive sand volleyball, and I do a targeted ketogenic diet. First few hours, if I'm out there like 8 hours in a tournament in the heat, in the sand, first few hours I'll do, Gatorade or some candy, basically no fat, and just have what I want. And I feel the benefits of both being on the ketogenic diet and using glucose for fuel, dual fuel. But when I'm working out, since I'm not a competitive lifter and absolute numbers of strength don't matter, I do no carb and often fasted, so I can make the adaptations. I can get the mitochondrial biogenesis, where I have more mitochondria. I want upregulated MCT transporters, so I take up more BHB. I want to make these adaptations that happen over time. So I'm very keto adapted, but occasionally I will use that targeted, like Ryan said, it's a tool. So.
Yeah, and it's important to differentiate. You guys talked about that, and Shawn talked about the differences between your workouts when you're going to use that. People have this idea, and it's funny. Like my wife used to work at a running store. She was a distance runner in college at NAU. She's working at a running store, and people are coming in off the streets. They want to get into running. They got a tire around their waist, and they're like, "How many gels should I buy?" Like, 0. You don't fucking need them for your 2K walk jog each morning.
Right.
And that's if you were consistent. You still wouldn't need that. You might not need it for your 5K. You might not ever need it, right? If you're in a race, maybe, but a good diet will give you more in glycogen than slamming power gels and little Gushers candies while you're doing that. So I think it's important to differentiate, and then this other concept that Shawn brought up, which was huge for me to realize when I had Dr. Andy Galpin on the show, fucking wizard, that guy. He was talking about this concept: we're either optimizing or we're adapting. And so to constantly be optimized and in this perfect state, we're kind of taking stressors out of the equation so we can be at our very best. And that may be fine for a podcast when I want to be cognitively optimized. I'm not going to hit high intensity interval training right before this interview because I want all my fucking nutrients. I want my spark, right? But this idea of I can go back and forth, and there should be times where I'm really stressing the body at all costs for mitochondria, for longevity, for adaptation, where now my body will actually really ramp up ketone production. And then there'll be other workouts where it's like, no, I'm going to test myself today, and it's going to be a longer one. So maybe I should add a little carbohydrates, or I should have beta hydroxybutyrate and some other forms to really make sure that I'm tapping out and maxing everything that I have in the reserves. Yeah, so much to that. I did my second 5-day water fast. I remember hearing Dominic D'Agostino talk about that, doing that was, I think, the nail in the coffin for me, hearing him do a 7-day water fast, deadlift 500 pounds for
Yeah,
10
sick.
or 15 reps,
He's a beast.
pull
Yeah.
585 for a single, and then give a lecture to 300 plus people on the benefits of fasting and ketosis.
He's the man.
Yeah, absolutely incredible.
So you're talking about, I mean, just in terms of life, like the hormetic response, like where you want to challenge yourself. That's why like low intensity, steady state, you know, when people just talk about cardio, you're not getting that much as far as results. You're just burning calories, moving the body. But high intensity interval training, like you're talking about, or pushing yourself, you know, with lifting and you're at that 90, 95, whatever, near your max capacity, that threshold, that's where adaptation takes place. And you need those stressors, right? Or else you don't get those changes in your body. And if you're always doing what you're saying, like optimizing, like, which is what I would think like exercise is at low intensity, steady state, is kind of optimized. Like you're not exhausted, you're able to maintain for a long period of time, right? Then you're not getting changes. So it makes sense. Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. It's a funny deal because like retiring from MMA, I didn't want, like I was sick of high intensity intervals. It's like, I'm done with this, you know, like let me just do long distance running and powerlifting because it's fun. And you know, the reps are low enough, even if I'm sore. It's not like high volume bodybuilding training. I'm not doing a 20 rep squat, shit like that. So I really was never very sore, always felt good. And then doing jujitsu, getting back into jujitsu, it's like, oh shit, I'm missing something here. You know, I still have to have muscular endurance and I still have to do the things that I don't necessarily like doing. And then as jiu-jitsu kind of pulled me back into that, like, all right, I can hit some high intensity intervals on an assault bike, or I can go run hill repeats, or I can do something, but it's necessary to cover all the bases. And then in those things that I don't like doing, as I get into better shape and the brain works and you get that adaptation, it's like, oh, I do miss this because there is something to it in the way you feel when you hit some of these workouts that they aren't fun while you're doing them, right?
Right.
Well, and dealing with physiologic stress like that, like heavy weights or high intensity interval training, also increases your capacity to deal with life stress. It's the same to your body. Like you have a higher capacity to deal with these things. And we are in a society that we're controlling ourselves so much, like you're talking about. Like think about like we're thermically controlled, right? All day
Everything's
long.
climate control.
Right. All day long, it's like 68 to 72 degrees. We've lost that capacity to deal with these things. And now we're seeing like people do like contrasting with like, you know, cold showers and hot saunas and seeing the benefits to brown adipose tissue and lipolysis and, you know, growth hormone and heat shock proteins and all these cool things that are like happening metabolically, like when you challenge the body. And again, you can deal with stress on a greater level wherever it may come from, just because you can deal with hot and cold.
100%. Yeah, it's been a game changer for me. Another guy I picked up from Ferris and then Rogan's was Wim Hof.
Yeah.
There's just
amazing.
no doubt.
Crazy,
There's no doubt. I think I was telling you at this dinner we met at, Shawn, about getting the chest freezer. You get a meat freezer, fill it full of water and some Epsom salt, and you only got to plug it in a few hours every other day, and it stays right at 35 degrees.
Wow.
But in that, I'll never have to buy ice again. You know, like it's one fee up front, it's Energy Star efficient, and then I'm good to go on all my ice baths, as opposed to spending 40 to 60 bucks on bags of ice and lugging that around while it's melting in my trunk, you know, and to throw it into a horse trough and change that water out constantly. It's just a pain in the ass. So I like the idea of adding in different hormetic stressors that not only improve the way I perform, but ultimately longevity, right? And I think the older we get, even if we start in athletics, these are all things we start thinking about. Like it all comes down to, you know, I want to play with my grandkids, not just my children. I want to play with my grandkids, right?
And that's a huge piece. It's actually something where, from an athletic standpoint, not only just overall human performance and longevity, but from an athlete perspective, we're starting something right now called Life After the Game with a lot of our NFL athletes. And a lot of them are starting to realize kind of what you were saying is, I want to have a life after this. Like, what happens? And everyone's seen what's gone on in the NFL and the whole concussion and traumatic brain injury, CTE concept. So a lot more are becoming more and more open and aware of, how do I protect my brain so that way when the time is done and I'm no longer playing, how do I do that? And we think that ketosis has a huge opportunity there. So starting something around that, NFL guys are just one, but MMA's enormous, NHL athletes, a lot of these athletes want to have a life after the sport. And how do you provide that? And it's amazing to see so many more people be open to it, and see there is a possibility that I can protect it and start now.
Yeah, that's a huge one. It was really a something that drew me towards it, because I could feel it, after I had a fight like with Glover Teixeira. I couldn't even find the fucking locker room. I was lost, literally, and didn't tell anybody because I didn't want a longer extension of how long you got to wait between fights. And so I just wandered around making small talk with people till I found the locker room. That's a shitty feeling to have. I was concussed, didn't sleep well for a few nights. And then I would catch myself like talking to people and just completely lose my train of thought. And I couldn't navigate back. Like you talk to an old timer and they're like, oh, what was I saying? You're like, oh, you're on this, and this. Oh, yeah. And then they catch it again. I couldn't catch it. I couldn't get back to where it was. And I'd be like, well, fuck it. It's not important. But realizing that and seeing, some people that I trained with that were only a few years older, like really watching that decline, it's like, fuck, this is real. Like it's a big deal. And I've worked with Ricky Williams and different guys from the NFL on the benefits of cannabis, and they're studying THC in the brain, clearing amyloid plaque. Yes. There's a Japanese researcher out of UCSF right now in San Francisco studying it for Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's. And so it's cool to see all these different tools coming into play that can really help people, because people do this. I mean, obviously NFL is a business. You want to get paid when you do it. Not many people sign up for fun. You can't do it from within the app, but something we love, right? You're always going to do something you love till you can't do it anymore. You don't want to look back on that 10 years after the fact and say, what the fuck did I do? Exactly. So having these tools really gives me hope and gives others hope. And like the first time I got into ketosis, I thought, I feel my brain work better than it has since I was a kid. Like, should I go back to school? Like, what am I going to do with this? And just reading more, like, let me just read more on ketosis. Let me read more on diet, health, and wellness.
Well, the crazy thing is, going to that point is, if you look, kind of like your ability to recall something, like someone who's older and forgets it. If you look at the brains of these athletes, whether it's a UFC guy, an NFL athlete, their brains are resistant to taking up glucose.
Right.
It's known, well documented in the literature. After a game or after, like, there needs to be some protocol drastically implemented on not only pre, during, and after these events, but their brains cannot take up and effectively utilize glucose. And what do? We go and we're slugging down drinks and shakes that are filled with carbohydrates, but our brain can't take it up and utilize it. It sounds counterintuitive. And then 10 years later, we see the effects of what that does. And so if you look at the brains of some of these individuals, very similarly, you put them like side by side with someone who has Alzheimer's, you wouldn't really be able to pick out the difference. Wow. In these athletes. And you're starting to see early onset Alzheimer's, early onset Parkinson's in these individuals, a lot of it due to the byproduct and the side effects of not being able to take up and utilize a fuel source immediately after their game or competition.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a condition called like insufficient cellular energy, and they're glucose intolerant. So basically the electron transport chain, there's an issue in the secondary complex of the electron transport chain, and these mitochondria aren't getting fuel. So there is no, and by the way, like Alzheimer's is typically now called type 3 diabetes, and it's a situation of glucose intolerance. So what you're talking about with concussions and Alzheimer's is actually very similar. And there is no scenario really that I can think of where there's a ketone intolerance issue. So that's where you have a superiority. Now, when people talk about that hate on keto, that, I do great on glucose and, whatever, eating carbs all day, like that's awesome. But if you're diabetic, if you have metabolic syndrome, if you have a likelihood for concussions, like there's certainly data that's coming out, cancer, Parkinson's, like Ryan's saying, that where you might be in a state of insufficient cellular energy, or you have too much glucose or insulin issues that clearly ketogenic dieting is superior for.
Yeah, and I think that's a massive part of our population now.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
These aren't small fucking
That's why
numbers.
it's so relevant.
They're not small numbers.
And I mean, there's even data on showing that with people with metabolic syndrome, that keto is superior to low-fat dieting without exercise. Keto without exercise is better than low-fat dieting with exercise. So you think about, like you say, like a lot of the Western population is obese, has metabolic syndrome. They might be in a place where, because of their age, because of their weight, because of their abilities, that exercising is difficult, right? And so them doing keto and it being superior to kind of what we've been told is a standard low-fat diets and exercise, I mean, that gives them a much better place to start from, hopefully, and resolve some of these conditions. Obviously, it would be superior with exercise added to the mix, but you know, that's impressive. That's powerful about this diet, that you can have metabolic syndrome, you can be overweight, but you can find a way through it. And that's what we're seeing. That's why keto is becoming so popular. And the people that are bashing it constantly are people that are in great shape, people that have high insulin sensitivity, and great
and they
for them.
usually sell a carbohydrate.
Yeah,
You know what I'm
right.
saying? Like
But-
fucking Lane Norton
Right.
is yoked and the guy's got fucking carbs for sale. Of course he's going to be anti. It's like, okay, you got a
Dude.
vested interest in keeping people buying your products. It's pretty easy to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about metabolic flexibility, because there's one thing that I've noticed, you know, with and just to chime in on the last piece, like I had mentioned to you guys before the podcast, I train probably 3 or 4 days a week now, and I am as vascular and as lean as I was when I was fighting, training 2 to 3 times a day. Like that tells me something. Like I haven't worked out all week, and not by choice, just due to having to grind through work, and that's okay. I feel fucking phenomenal, you know, and I know when I go back to lifting weights this weekend, like I'm not losing much there.
Dude,
know?
you look like you should be on the cast of Vikings.
Literally, yes.
So and from, you know, like I'm done. I'm not a professional athlete anymore. I don't need to train that often. I've got a kid. I've got work. I've got all these things that are common issues for people. Like, man, I can't make it to the gym for an hour. And I teach them about kettlebells. I teach them about other things, ways you can grease the groove, one of Pavel's terms. So you get a little bit built throughout the day. But ultimately, diet's number one. It really is. Like there is no greater thing. And the problem is we've been sold this lie on eat less, train more, right? Calories in, calories out, you know, and there was a beautiful study that Tim Ferriss posted in the 4-Hour Body, where they put everyone on a 2,000 calorie diet, groups A, B, and C. Group A was high carb, 90% carbs. Group B was 90% protein, and group C was 90% fat. Group A with the carbohydrate gained a pound a day. Group B lost, I think, close to a half a pound a day on 90% protein, and Group C lost over a pound a day on 90% fat. There was zero comparison on who the clear-cut winner is. You know, it's fascinating to me to see that. And then, like you were saying, Shawn, with people who really can't work out, you know, people who are in a place where a 1-hour walk is going to be taxing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we need tools. We need places where people can go to shift their body and then eventually have control over themselves again.
Right.
And to have control over food. I mean, how many people are like, fuck, I tried that keto thing and I couldn't kick my carb cravings. And then I go back, you know, like, and like, well, how long did you go? Well, I mean, I went hard for a couple of weeks, and it's like, you kind of didn't get through the rough spot there. You know, there's some fine tuning to that. How do you guys help people when it comes to being able to be effective into getting into ketosis and getting through that keto adaptation period?
It's huge. It's definitely a huge point. And one of the things we've researched pretty heavily is some people like to just dip their toe in the water and they're like, I don't know about this.
Mm-hmm.
They feel horrible and then they cut out. And they're like, nope, I felt horrible. That thing sucked. I'm out. The one thing is like you talked about, incorporating in intermittent fasting helps tremendously. And we actually found during the adaptation period, even though it sucks, it's brutal. Even during that adaptation period, exercise harder, not less.
Right.
Because the goal is to what? To deplete muscle glycogen, so that way you start upregulating these enzymes, start increasing fat metabolism, start producing endogenous ketones. The faster you can do that, the quicker you'll adapt. So we always talk about intermittent fasting. We talk about knock out some high intensity interval training very early on, and then supplement with electrolytes. Because you're going to, once insulin's low and you're starting to cut out these carbohydrates, you replenish with things like sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. These things will help you not get or experience what's commonly termed the keto flu and overcome that. So those three things help tremendously.
And think about how long people have been glucogenically adapted, right? And
Your
then
whole life.
then we see,
Exactly.
yeah, right. And then we see these studies that keto does this, like to the gut microbiome, and it's like, oh, that was 1 week of keto dieting, like for these people that have been glucogenic for 30 years. I mean, I'm glad that one of the things that they did in their studies from the outset was ketogenically adapt all their participants in all their studies, usually for at least 10 days to 14 days, right? So, I mean, that's a great start in the right direction, but we don't know. Like, it would be nice if we had a study population of Inuits or something like where we could look at people that have been that way all their life and then assess what their needs are for vitamins and minerals, or what their needs are. With all these different scenarios, we don't know. We're always saying, here's this glucogenic person, and here's what happens 1 week, 6 months in, maybe. We don't know what the actual implications of all these things are long term.
Well, the game changes. It absolutely changes. And Dr. Volek did one of the best studies, I think, to date, where he looked at individuals. I think Ben Greenfield is actually a participant.
was,
the
yeah.
faster study.
Yeah, the faster study. And these
2 or 3 muscle biopsies a day.
brutal. But they got a ton of data out of that.
Yeah.
And they found that these individuals who were basically keto adapted for at minimum 6 months, most of them were well over a year, were able to replenish glycogen, which is a big concern. How do I have enough glycogen to perform? We're able to replenish glycogen to the same extent without having carbohydrates. They had like a shake afterwards, maybe with 4 grams of carbohydrates, to the same extent as Western diet adapted athletes that had 50 or 60 grams of carbohydrates. So our bodies are very adaptable and very good at recognizing, hey, I can make glycogen out of other things. I can make it out of non-essential amino acids, or glycerol, which is like the backbone of fatty acids. It's very good at doing that once you're adapted. So like you said,
Alanine.
we need these longer term studies. And clearly, like Dr. Volek's data shows, people like Ben who have been doing that for a very long time, the whole dynamic changes.
I like looking at the animal kingdom too. Like, it makes me think of what is our human potential. And if you look at, like, people are like, oh, keto, those aren't good athletes. And I just think, like, man, like a cheetah seems to do all right, like for speed, right?
Yeah.
Like
They
some
got
of these
high end output.
yeah, like they seem to run
They're not
pretty
run-
fast. Like,
They're not
fastest
jogging the
animal on the
Western States
planet.
100.
right? And then, there's other things too. Like, you look at certain animals like gorillas that eat just vegetation all day, and they're jacked beyond belief. So, like, what is this thing? Like, and it could be that they're highly insulin sensitive. It could be that leucine threshold is very low for them. We don't know, but I love thinking about these things when people try and say, they put things in a box, like, this is where we're at. This is what our potential is. No, it's not.
Yeah, it's not even close. I'm happy you brought up the gorilla, because a lot of vegan friends of mine will bring that shit up. Like, not enough protein on a vegan diet, and they just show some fucking giant gorilla.
Oh, God.
And it's like, well, they produce cellulose. They can eat fucking anything
Right.
plant rich. They don't even have to cook it. Like, why do you think we cook food?
Right.
We
Cellulase,
absorb
yeah.
more beta carotene from a carrot when it's cooked than when we eat it raw. There's a reason for that. There's a big reason for that. Cows have 4 fucking stomachs.
Yeah. Right.
We have 1. Right.
Right.
There's a lot to it. Our large intestine is much smaller than our ancestors. Right. So there's so much more into that, but I think,
It's fascinating.
it is fascinating. And
Yeah.
what's cool is that, some of the theories on how our brains grew quicker were that we figured out how to cook. Terrence McKenna thinks it was mushrooms. I'd love it if that was true, but I don't necessarily agree.
With BDNF.
I think,
right?
BDNF. So we have this ability to take nutrient dense foods and absorb them. And if I think of things like organ meat, which is loaded with the most bioavailable micronutrients on the planet, I can eat organ meat once a week and be topped off for the week with vitamin A and heme iron and a lot of critical things that I need, right? That comes from meat, and then fats. Like we have just the best fats on the planet now. But let's dive into something that I think is a massive misnomer, is this idea that if it fits your macros, right? Like as long as I get my, 60 to 80% fat in, it doesn't matter where it comes from. I know Jimmy Moore has changed his tune over time, but originally when he wrote Keto Clarity, which is a terrific how-to get into ketosis, he was recommending Nathan's hot dogs and just fucking garbage food, not grass-fed, free-range animals, not high-quality fats. Talk about the difference between those two and how they can impact the body.
Well, I know with me, I mean, think about it this way. Like, there's paleo and primal and ancestral, and we can all argue like what that meant. There's actually some data that shows that paleo man, certain tribes were cannibals.
Mm-hmm.
So
pygmy tribes that only lived on yams.
Right. There you go. Right. So
Consistent.
what is it we're emulating? But I can tell you that 200 years ago, we weren't having artificial sweeteners, artificial flavors, antibiotics, RBGH, RBST, all these kinds of things. How ultra processed food. And it's not only processed food anymore. There's a new term called ultra processed food. And all these things that were in the bags and boxes in our grocery stores, we weren't meant to eat. So I can tell you that, like, that's pretty clear. Like, so eating these things that gets us back to whole food, which you're seeing like keto, paleo, intermittent fasting is becoming like the holy trinity, right? Because it all makes sense. I mean, we can be dual fuel. We can have keto. And the argument against keto drives me insane, because if you were to go back to paleo days, intermittent fasting, that would be, I'm looking for food. I can't find it. I want to eat.
IF is the daily.
Right.
If you eat,
right,
that's not guaranteed.
And especially during the winter, before there was like food storage and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they would have gone days without eating. They would have been in ketosis. And if they found something, it most likely was an animal, so they would have been in ketosis. Probably during the summer, they would have been eating carbs. Cool. So they're dual fuel. But think about their carbohydrate-based diet. That a lot of that stuff was raw, and we're seeing like things like potatoes that we think of as high glycemic. Those are resistant starches when they're cold and they're raw. So they could have still been ketogenic, eating things like potatoes or roots, right? Because they were going, they were out there hunting, they were out there walking, they were out there trying to find food. And maybe they get some food, and maybe it's a resistant starch, and they're still in ketosis. So a lot of the time, I'm assuming maybe half the time, paleo man, we were probably in ketosis.
Yeah, even the fruits that were seasonally available were way higher in fiber and way less sweet. I think I was reading Eating on the Wild Side, and they were talking about how we systematically take strains, no different than weed, to make them higher in THC, right? There's 119 different bananas. At one point, now we have one banana in the world. Pretty much.
Crazy.
Like, we got rid of all the other bananas that weren't sweet enough and picked the best banana for our palate, not for weight gain, not for weight loss, not for health. Right? So what we have available today, you wake up in the world and you're like, yeah, we got a corded phone. I can talk to people, if you're in your 30s or 40s. And then kids now, they're like, yeah, I got a fucking iPad. It's the norm, right? So this banana is what a banana is. They don't think about backtracking that to maybe this stuff didn't taste as good at one point, but maybe it was a lot better.
Well, to your point, green bananas would have the resistant starch as well. So
yeah. A lot of tribes will eat green plantains,
There you go.
So it's like they haven't lost that part
right
of the culture. It's still embedded in them. You touched a little bit about metabolic flexibility. And that's one of the biggest takeaways I liked in the Keto Reset Diet with Mark Sisson, is this concept that, because Dominic D'Agostino is like, oh, everyone should do this for the rest of their lives, and be in some mod keto for the rest of their lives. And I'm not sure that's the answer, but at least a period of every year, we should practice that, right? If no refrigeration, no shipping in bananas from Panama or durian fruit from Asia or whatever, it's like, yeah, we didn't have fruits available year round. We didn't have refrigeration and canning practices to keep fucking sugary peaches available year round. So at least a portion of the year, we should practice this. And in doing so, when we go back to carbohydrates, we probably tolerate them better.
Right. And I think you should actually, along with that, it makes sense to only eat during the light window, the day wake cycle. Like, so you're following your circadian rhythm. Like it wouldn't be natural to be eating when it's dark. Right?
Yeah, Dr. Sachin Panda talks quite a bit about this.
Yeah,
it's massive. I think he has a great app called Zero app. I don't know if it's his, but they use a lot of his science behind it. And you can actually it's a fasting tracker. So, when you finish your last bite of food at dinner, you click start, and you can set that to whatever your goal is, and it'll ping you when you're done with your 16-hour fast or your whatever hour fast, 24-hour fast. Really cool. But you can click on the science, and it'll actually send you to a YouTube video with him and Dr. Rhonda Patrick. And you can also have it set to only eating when the sun's up. So it knows your time zone. And when the sun goes down, it'll actually track how far you ate into that darkness window.
That's awesome.
Right.
That's
so you can start to chip away at these things over time, because it's very hard to implement all the things right at once. There's a few type A's that are like, I'm fucking going in, and they do it. Right. But for a lot of people, it's easier to make small adjustments over time that stick and last.
Yes.
Right. And that's the key, sustainability. And kind of going back to your point with metabolic flexibility, it's like I like to look at this as like my lifestyle's changed. It's not a diet that I'm going to do for the next 4 weeks and just say, all right, cool, that was nice, on to something else. Like, I've implemented a lifestyle, but in order to do that, I'm not going to be strict 365 days a year for the rest of my life. And I actually think there could be some downside to that. Like, so imagine you're strict for 10 months straight, unless there's therapeutic applications or you're trying to do something there, but you're strict 10 months straight, and then you have some birthday blowout. And for that weekend, you go and you're like, you know what, I'm going to blow it out this weekend. Like, you're bound to be somewhat insulin resistant at that point, because the enzymes and processes that break down carbohydrates are down regulated, and you just blew it out on a carb feed, and you're gonna pay the price for that. So maintaining some degree of metabolic flexibility, I think, is extremely important. And one of the ways I do it is I'll do every couple of weeks, I'll do like a huge protein up. And I like doing that. Like, I'll taper fat down, increase carbs a bit, but majority of it comes from protein. And like the pumps I get in the gym, it's just, I can tell, for me, it's kind of like what Mark alludes to, is like this reset for me of going, okay, back into it. Now, if I want to go and hit it hard again and go stricter on keto, I can do that, or maintain this more flexible zone, which I tend to do quite often.
Yeah. I do CKD and TKD myself. So it's what's maintainable.
Cyclical ketogenic dieting and targeted ketogenic dieting. Sorry, I want to break down acronyms for people that are like, what did he say he did?
Right. So like what Ryan's saying is like, what can I do for life? Like, how is this maintainable for life? I don't want to deprive myself or feel like I'm deprived for life. But I think that way this is very maintainable. And to Ryan's point, not only is it like insulin resistance, but like you stop making certain enzymes that I think when people are super strict on keto and then they finally go back to having some type of carbs, like especially bread or, something like that, they feel gassy and bloated and terrible. And, it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy where like, oh no, like, I had carbs and it just destroyed me. So I think it's important to just, I have like one meal every 2 weeks or, 1 or 2 meals where I just have whatever I want, and that's maintainable. And I look forward to it. I don't beat myself up over it. I enjoy it. And then I'm back in.
I like that you mentioned that timeline, because for me, when I've done cyclical, that's the way where I feel the best, because some people are like every 4th day. And you're like, wait a minute, son. It might take 4 days just to get into ketosis.
Boom.
Like you're never actually reaching the glory spot again with the frequency of carbohydrates you're eating, right? Especially if you're not doing high intensity intervals to really rob and deplete that glycogen.
Exactly. We actually did a study on this. Haven't even published it yet.
Really?
No. So basically we looked at this. So what happens to these people who aren't necessarily fat adapted, but go into this and go, you know what, I'm going to start that keto thing, but every weekend I'm just going to blow it out. And some actually people in this space recommend this. They're like, oh, screw it. Just eat keto Monday through Friday, Saturday, Sunday, do whatever the hell you want, and then come back on Monday. So we're like, all right, let's study this. We actually looked at that and compared to a ketogenic diet for 8 to 10 weeks. The people who ate cyclically were keto Monday through Friday and then blew it out on the weekend. Like you said, they'd start to get into ketosis maybe Thursday, Friday, and then they'd crush pizza and cake on the weekends, come back out, and they wouldn't get back into ketosis until like the following Friday. And it was just this roller coaster where they were really never in ketosis and they were dieting. We put them on a slight calorie deficit, and they both groups lost the same amount of total weight. So on a scale, it'd be a win. Yeah, cyclical wins on a scale, but that's not what matters. What matters is body composition. The majority of what the cyclical group lost was muscle mass, very little fat mass, while the ketogenic dieting group lost primarily fat mass. Why? Well, kind of what we talked about earlier, there's a muscle preservation about being in a state of ketosis. So these people were dieting, didn't really have ketones elevated to any significant degree. So a lot of it was wasting away. Their muscle catabolism's at an all-time high. So there does need to be some fat adaptation ahead of time. Like you said, it's not every 4 days you just carb up. Adapt yourself first and then have some flexibility with it, but just be conservative. Don't blow it out at a buffet every day for every weekend and then try and go back in.
But who knows if you're like a bodybuilder that's been adapted to the ketogenic diet for years and years and years, maybe you could do 2 days.
And I think,
we don't know.
Right.
Honestly,
that
though,
study
I
was
think
very relevant.
bodybuilders for every part of this conversation are the outliers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's something I
Right,
talked about on Rogan's was that they eat the baby diet. No human's supposed to eat every fucking 2 hours other than babies, right? Who are growing and who have also abnormal amounts of hormone levels. So protein synthesis and insulin sensitivity, all those things are going to be maxed out in a bodybuilder's body, thanks to modern science, and also in a baby's body, because that's what we're fucking designed to do, right? If you don't fit in that population as a baby or a bodybuilder, then it doesn't really apply, you know? And I think that having time in, I mean, really it comes down to fuel preference, right? So if your body prefers ketones because it's been in a state of keto adaptation for 8 to 12 weeks, and then you go back to having carbohydrates, it's going to be easier to get back into ketosis as long as you give it that break. But you're in no man's land if you're having once a week or twice a week where you're having carbohydrates. You're in no man's land because you've robbed yourself of carbohydrates consistently, which need to be fairly often, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not producing ketones yet adequately, and your body's not absorbing them adequately.
And it gets messier with like net carbs and, people kind of playing around with because some of these sugar alcohols can raise your glycemic index. Some of these short chain fibers that are very unique, like isomalto oligosaccharides, IMO, are very unique. And, people are kind of hovering around nutritional ketosis, where if you look at like blood BHB would be 0.5. But they're never really like seeing like the magic of ketosis, which is why I think intermittent fasting is more powerful than nutritional ketosis or nutritional ketogenic diet. It's incredible. Like you can be low carb and be intermittent fasted, and I think you'll get deeper into ketosis than someone who's doing a true ketogenic diet and not fasting. Because like the magic can happen like when you're deeper. Like let's say if you were looking at blood BHB, maybe it's like 2.5, 3.5, somewhere like in there, you start getting like this cognitive clarity. And people aren't experiencing that. Like they're staying in like this brain fog, like not getting the fat loss benefits because they're never really getting into ketosis. They're just kind of hovering in and out, in and out. They're not making adaptations. they're not probably doing enough exercise to deplete glycogen like Ryan was talking about. So I think that's like when I hear someone's like just doesn't like keto, it's like they're not adapting. Like that's what I think of. They're not fasting. Their fat's probably not high enough. So they're doing gluconeogenesis because their protein's too high. And they're probably using net carbs.
Yeah, that's a big hump for people to get over is how much fat you need. And then people joke, like they'll see me make a bone broth, or I'll take like one box of Kettle and Fire, which I love, super high quality, tastes great. And their chicken and mushroom uses fucking lion's mane, which is incredibly good for the brain.
Yeah.
And then I'll throw a whole stick of Kerrygold or Vital Farms butter in there. 8 ounces of butter, a couple of tablespoons of MCT oil, some turmeric, black pepper, and sea salt. And that's a meal, right? But and through the course of the day, I'm going to have way more fat than people think is healthy, right? My cholesterol looks gorgeous. My VLDL is tanked. It's in the single digits.
That's awesome.
Like it's never looked better in my entire life.
Love it.
And that comes from increasing the good fats. And that's where we get full, right? Like, how am I going to get full if I'm not eating meat? I can't just keep loading kale onto my plate. Like, you're right. You're right. You can't just keep loading kale onto your plate. Like, you should have a good amount of cruciferous or dark leafy greens and a handful of meat, but the rest has to come from fat.
Right. It's an important piece. And like you said, it's a challenge for people to wrap their mind around, wait a minute. Like oftentimes when people start and they have no direction on a ketogenic diet, you'll look at it and you'll analyze, hey, what are you eating? And they're like, well, I just, especially again, like the bodybuilder crew, it's like, oh, well, I just cut out the rice for my chicken and vegetables. It's like,
chicken breast and asparagus.
Yeah, like that ain't going to do it. That's not going to do it. So like you said, it's super important to get in those high quality fats. And that's something, it's a hurdle and a leap for a lot of people, but explaining it once they understand, oh, wow, here's a lot of the benefits of what fats can do and why it's important to get a good amount of fats on it. I mean, people love avocados, people love MCTs, like getting those in are extremely important, especially when you're on a ketogenic diet. Even
the bodybuilder diet, I used to do that because I've always been low carb and I've done ketogenic dieting, but I've also done the bodybuilder diet that's eating clean, of having the high protein, basically low fat, low carb, and it's exactly what you're talking about, like chicken breast and broccoli, or fish and asparagus or whatever, and you're eating every few hours because you're in this like hangry state where you're, the high carb diet makes more sense, or the high fat diet makes sense because at least you're adapting to one fuel or the other. You're putting yourself in like this punishing brain fog state.
It's all gluconeogenesis.
Where you're just constantly hangry, and like the smallest changes in your blood glucose feel like you're hypoglycemic. Like you could probably drop 5 or 10 points and you feel like, you're like in the floor in the toilet, you need to eat. And I remember when I was in that state, like first thing I'd wake up, I was like, I wanted to punch someone in the face. I wanted to eat immediately. If someone said 15 minutes before we can eat, I would just go insane, but now that like I'm ketogenic, that's not the case. Like I can just, wait till lunch.
Yeah.
You get up,
a meal, you're an hour late, big deal.
Right.
Exactly. You're still fine, right? Because your body is constantly feeding itself. Right. You have like this mainline IV drip of energy coming in 24/7.
There you go.
It's a totally different ball game. Well, we're getting low on time here, but there are a couple more questions I want to ask. One, you guys talked about, and something that I'd first read in the Keto Reset Diet, was this polar opposite compared to what we were told initially as the research was coming out. A lot of people would say that long, slow fat burning mode is going to be better for getting you into ketosis because you're not going to burn through glycogen. You won't be as hungry for sugars and carbs. And then now we're like, no, wait. You want to get in quicker, or you have you go to a birthday party, you drink a little too much, or you, whatever the case is, you have some pizza watching the fights. How do I get back quicker? It's not doing a 4-mile walk. It's bust your ass, deplete that glycogen, and force, even though you won't read high ketones on the blood meter that day, that's going to get you back quicker. Talk about how you guys figured that out and what you've done.
Exactly. So you want to get in as quickly as possible. So I think that's where the ultimate combination, like Shawn was mentioning, of this intermittent fasting is just exploded, and high intensity interval training. Like you want to be able, yeah, if you're eating some pizza, watching the fight, cool, that's fine. The next day, maybe you do a longer intermittent fast and you crush some high intensity interval training and you'll be fine by the nighttime, versus prolonging that effect. It's only going to, similar to like when people prolong dieting, it's going to prolong the effects that come along with it. Get back in as soon as possible. Do it via intermittent fasting, high intensity interval training, incorporating in resistance training as well. So that way the glycogen's being utilized by various muscle tissue as well. That's the way to do it. That's the way to best approach it. And that's what we found in our lab.
That's amazing. And then one last question I want to leave is what have you guys seen with the strength training group that varies? Because one of the cool things that I think it was called Get Serious. I forget the name of the author. He's a neuroscientist, just jacked to the gills. And he was talking about the differences between like when we do long steady state cardio and we're just burning calories at that time, you end that cardio session, you're really done burning calories. You're not too sore. Versus you strength train, you hit some heavy weights and you're sore around the clock. That's taking resources around the clock to rebuild. Did you see it was easier, or what were the differences that you saw when you were looking at the strength train group that was in ketosis?
Yeah. So we found that these guys were able to recover just as well. The ones that were in ketosis. After 10 weeks, we found they were able to gain just as much muscle, lose significantly more fat mass than their Western diet counterparts. And one of the things that we did that was unique about the study is we matched for protein intake. So 99% of studies don't. And that's the big argument that high carb advocates will say is like, oh, well, they had more protein. That's the reason why they saw the adaptation. So I said, screw that. We'll match for protein intake. And so we did, and we found those changes. Since that time, there's since been studies out of Auckland University on powerlifters that found similar results, and 2 studies on CrossFit athletes who basically took CrossFit athletes and put them on a ketogenic diet either for 8 or 12 weeks, saw that they were able to perform just as well, make improvements in performance as their Western diet counterparts, yet lose significantly more body fat. So it's just been replicated over and over again when you implement kind of what we were talking about earlier, a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And there's a big difference between what some people implement for therapeutic purposes, like epilepsy and what they're doing in the cancer realm, versus a well-formulated, getting in a good amount of fiber, getting in an adequate amount of protein, and then filling in a good chunk of that with fat. Like that's the well-formulated part, and that's where we're seeing these benefits come from.
That's amazing.
And his lab, ASPE, Applied Science Performance Institute down in Tampa, they have Wingit bikes, which are just amazing. They're typically only in research labs, but I have done that. Ben Pekulski trained at their facility, and one of his preps, that was all he did to get shredded. He didn't even do any cardio. That was just only Wingate. And 3 minutes on this bike, you want to talk about high intensity interval training? Like you will be on the floor feeling like you're going to vomit. And you talk about like the calorie burning, like literally the next 3 hours, I would feel like I'm on fire. Like my body temperature's up. I don't want to eat. Just exhausted. Like it's incredible. Yeah. Like when you really push that limit, what can happen?
And that's how you deplete glycogen. And that's what we saw in our studies is you take literally one 30-second Wingate, 30 seconds of, and everyone's like, oh, I could do that for 30 seconds. Most people, we work with the Tampa Bay Lightning, a lot of NFL teams, they dread coming in to utilize this Wingate bike. Dread it. 30 seconds, you can deplete muscle glycogen by like 30 to 40% in an instant. So
I imagine that's a pretty expensive unit.
Not bad. Anywhere, probably about 10,000.
Maybe we'll get one here.
Yes, it definitely fits.
An excellent way to fix a bad night out watching.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Get back in very quick.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, so is your book out right now?
It is.
And where can people grab that?
On Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's the Ketogenic Bible. So we talk a lot of what we talked about today, all in that, and throw some cool recipes in there as well.
Hell yeah.
Awesome website too, ketogenic.com.
Yeah, ketogenic.com basically has a ton of resources and doctors and all these different articles about traumatic brain. I wrote an article there on traumatic brain injury, a former athlete's perspective. Like, what do these individuals need to know? Not only athletes now, but like kids coming up. How should we approach that? So, tons of great resources.
Yep. And I'm on ShawnWells.com and then ZoneHalo.com. Zone Halo is my formulations and ingredients, and then Shawn Wells is kind of a biohacking site talking about keto and supplements. I am the world's greatest formulator. So
Without a doubt.
Fuck yeah, that's what we got here in town, brother. That's awesome, man. Thank you guys for and where are you guys on social media? People can follow you, give you a holler.
Yeah, on Facebook, Ryan Lowery. On Instagram, at Ryan P. Lowery. Everyone always jokes and says it's Ryan Plowry, but it's just my middle initial. I'm like, oh god, Ryan P. Lowery.
yeah, and I'm at Zone Halo on everything pretty much.
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
Mhm.
Awesome, gentlemen. Thank you so much. We'll definitely have you guys back on.
Thanks,
you.
brother.
Much
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.